Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. But this is not a Mormon Book Reviews episode per se. It is part of our segment called Mormon Media Reviews, and my frequent co-host, Rebecca Biblioteca, is in the house. How you doing this morning?
Good morning, Steve. I'm great. How are you?
Doing fantastic. Now, I'm glad you guys, I'm 2 hours ahead, so I'm half day, my day's halfway through, and you guys are just getting up, and I appreciate the time. I got always have to work my schedule around the mountain time zone and all that. But I'm really excited because we had this fantastic guest on. His name is Janice Kapp Perry, and he is the host of the BYU radio podcast, In Good Faith. And I love the concept of his channel. It's really fantastic because what he does is it's kind of an interreligious dialogue where he's having the engagement of the Latter-day Saints with other folk from other religions, including evangelical and Catholic and Protestant, you name it. He's talking to them, and we're finding commonalities, and I think this is great because, of course, my channel is the Switzerland of Mormonism. It's a safe space for everybody, and I think you've become your own Switzerland as well, where different people can bring their perspectives to the table. Stephen, welcome to the program.
Steve, thank you very much. Nice to be here.
So I thought, okay, so Rebecca brought you to my attention. And Rebecca, I said, I'm going to throw you under the bus this morning at the last minute and ask you to do the very first question. So Rebecca, the ball's in your court.
Well, and I can see how this might be a little confusing because we have Steve and Steve. So I wonder if we'll have to use nicknames or last names or something when we're all talking, but that's fine. Hopefully it will make sense. So yeah, and it was actually my husband, Tom, who suggested, who would be a great guest on Steve Pineker's show would be Janice Kapp Perry, because we've all been acquaintances and friends for a while, lived in the same area, and our sons have known each other. And so we've been aware of Steve and just all the amazing things that he is involved in, and especially this latest project that you've been working on for the last several years, the In Good Faith, which is amazing. So we just thought it'd be really fun to have you on and have others in Steve Pineker's audience get to know you and what you're doing, because I saw also a commonality between the two channels, just in the kind of people that you engage, the kind of dialogue that you're trying to have. So welcome, Steve, and why don't we just start out by just telling us a little bit about you and your background, and we'll just start from there.
Sure. I think it's kind of fun that our sons have been friends since junior high days in high school and still stay in touch. So I live in Provo, Utah now. This is where I went to high school. It's been home ever since. I spent the first 15 to 20 years of married life as a songwriter and a music producer in studios, and worked on various projects including for my mother, Janice Kapp Perry. Lots of LDS folks, of course, know and love her music, as do I. And then I gradually got into radio as the economy changed, meaning everyone could copy your music for free and email it to each other. And making a life as a songwriter started to go like this. So I was at FM 100 in Salt Lake City doing their Sunday programming and just loving being on that station for about 10 years. Then I came part-time to BYU Broadcasting on the classical station, which, with my musical background, was a really nice fit. I still announce every day, classical89.org, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Mountain Time, and you can hear me spin the greatest hits of the last 500 years.
Oh, that's great. It's true. Anybody who tunes in, you're probably right now going, I recognize that voice. I know that voice. So
it's possible. Classical 89. So, and then while I work here, BYU Radio, which is the talk show, the talk station, that's Sirius XM 143. We started doing radio shows more and more often, and then also posting them as podcasts. And then, of course, as you've seen the industry change, now we are a podcast production house that also happens to put some stuff on the radio locally. But so I have enjoyed this assignment to create In Good Faith. Right from the beginning, I heard the title and I thought, I'm there, because I have a picture of what this could be, which sounds like is sort of a common vision that I have from what I've seen of the interviews I've watched for you folks. So I was really happy that you would invite me to be on.
Well, yeah, we're happy to have you on too. And I want to talk some more, but you brought it up. I was going to bring it up later because I'm seeing the panel in the background. And of course, you talk about the musical background, talk about your musical background. I just want you to talk a little bit about your mother.
Oh, sure.
She's royalty in your world, and I maybe just talk a little bit about your mom.
Yeah, well, I'm very proud of her. I've always been glad when people say, "Is your mother?" Yes, indeed she is. She's a great lady. And she was always musical growing up, but she mostly played sports. And so she did women's fast pitch. She was the pitcher, and just very involved in athletics till about age 40. And then she noticed she could still pitch just as fast, but she couldn't get out of the way of the ball when it came back towards her. She was getting a little slower. And she actually broke her ankle playing basketball with my 6'4" 16-year-old nephew. She likes to point out she was winning at the time. And while her foot was up in a cast, the bishop of our local congregation came and said, "So I hear you're musical. We need music for our road show for extra points because we've got to beat the 27th ward this year." So that competitive killer instinct. And she said, "Well, I'll give it a try." And she started writing music and just loved it so much that she just launched herself into that.
Wow. So she actually didn't really start her music writing career until she was in her 40s?
Yeah, just about turning 40. And then just kind of went there. One of my favorite things about her, this is a life lesson I am trying to incorporate into my life, is she had written a bunch of songs for people who needed something, like, would you write something for our young women's group to sing? Or we need the primary boys to have a song they think is a strong song, like for boys to sing. That's where we got We'll Bring the World His Truth, or the Armies of Helaman.
Oh, and as a primary pianist, that is the most requested, when you throw it out to the kids and say, what would you like to sing? Boy, that's the one that they just love. That's an amazing song.
But the interesting thing about her is she sent in some of these songs because they were written for specific church uses. And she thought, well, other people maybe could use them too. And she got a sort of a friendly form letter-ish response saying, "Dear Sister Perry, thank you for sending your music. We don't really have a place for it or a way to use it, but if it needs to be heard in a wider sphere, it will find its place." So they didn't say bloom where you're planted, but it was sort of brighten your own little corner of Zion. And so I think a lot of people might have been really offended, like, brighten my own little bloom where I'm planted. She took that seriously. And she thought, well, that's what I'm doing. I'll just keep doing that. But those songs, because they filled a need, actually did just like the music department form letter said, start to find its way because people would hear something, they would want it. And now she has, I think, 10 different songs in the primary children's songbook, the current one. Of course, it's under revision for a new one now. Anyway, I just love that idea that she was not worried about the size of audience or had to have some notoriety. This is what she loved and thought, well, then, okay, I will make this a better place. I'll lift where I stand, essentially.
Wow, what a great story. Now, I have to tell you, this is another great story that I encountered early on. This is actually, when I first heard this story, it actually changed the trajectory of my channel, because initially my channel was supposed to be secular and scholarly, but then I heard the story about Arlene Buffington's The Songs of Zion for the Church of Jesus Christ. And this is one of the most remarkable hymnals ever made, because she didn't know any music. She couldn't read music. She couldn't carry a tune, but she had these songs supernaturally downloaded. And she I thought it was a few songs, 239 songs later.
Wow.
And it's one of the most remarkable hymnals ever made, supernaturally inspired. And the music is beautiful. And that's one of those beautiful things about encountering the restoration, is that I get to hear these fantastic stories from all these different groups, and it's really blessing me. And I imagine, Steve, that your channel, what you're doing, when you're interacting with other people and you're finding out other things, that you probably find yourself blessed from people from other faith traditions as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I usually run home after every interview day, and my wife knows she's gonna have to sit there for a minute while I talk about all the cool things whatever I can remember from the conversation. And maybe you've discovered that's the most thing, is to talk to people who maybe know something you don't know or have an experience you haven't had, and just be able to hear that. That's been really great. I actually jotted down, because when you're on the spot, you can't always remember your life accurately. So I jotted down just a couple of ideas from a few different guests. I don't know if you want to take a minute.
Oh, sure.
Oh, I think that was going to be one of our questions. Before that, though, I'm wondering if you could just very quickly, the idea for the show, the concept, was it yours? Was it BYU? Just sort of how did it start? Just for some of Steve's viewers that may not be completely familiar. And then I think one of my main questions was, please talk about some of the more notable guests. I have some I'd like to ask about, because I was going through that. But yeah, I think I'd love to hear just how did it happen? Because it's such a unique and interesting broadcast and so needed.
I think it kind of marked a turning point here. There was something happening at BYU Broadcasting, which was before it had been more inward facing. In other words, you could turn on BYU TV or BYU radio and hear music by the saints for the saints, or you could hear BYU forums or devotionals delivered on campus at BYU for the saints. And at some point there became a bit of an impetus to not just be inward facing in that circle, but actually to face outward, which meant two things. One, making programming both on BYU TV and BYU radio that would be applicable to a general audience. And we've got the Lisa show, Lisa Valentine Clark, amazing ways that you can do everything from self-care to family. She has this thing called the Council of Moms that they do a great job.
I'm gonna have to check that out.
Oh, it's great. It's the Lisa show. And top of mind is more of an investigation into interesting topics that could be legal, that could be anything that's very current. And then we've got Constant Wonder, which is about finding awe in the world, sometimes divine or religious, but often just in nature or in what we do for each other as human beings. And the Appleseed is like America's favorite storytelling podcast, and you'll find national figures. So where did faith fit into this? They've been sort of reaching out in different ways, but they wanted a faith component, not inward facing, but outward. And so Marcus Smith, who was our manager at the time, he said, I've got this title for a show. And he said, it wouldn't have worked 10 years ago because we had a different focus, but I think it's time. The title is In Good Faith. And I mean, all he had to do was say the title. And I said, I'm in. I can picture it already. And because I've always been really open to exploring and going to visit other churches or a synagogue or whatever it might be, and just learning. For whatever reason, I don't feel threatened. I think some people feel threatened going to a building of another faith for some reason. We could talk about that later. I have some ideas. But then I got to just start calling amazing people and hearing what we say is that on In Good Faith, we have first person accounts of believers celebrating the power of faith and belief in their life and sharing what those stories mean to them. So it's not a debate or anything like that. It's me asking, tell me how that felt, or why did you think that God was in that thing that happened, or whatever it might be. So it's just taken off from there. We've been able to start doing some topical episodes with panels now. We have one coming out right at the first of the year called How to Talk About Religion. And it's like a setup for a joke. A priest, a rabbi, an imam, and me sit down at a table, walk into a studio, and have great conversations. And we started a book club, so we can say, what's an inspirational book? Like, I know you're book people. That's what I'm tossing.
Oh, yeah.
We started with Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now. Just something that would be widely known in the concept of mindfulness. Next, we'll take the devotional book Gilead in February. We'll do a book. So we want our listeners to be reading for about 3 months, and then we have a roundtable discussion. They can even send in comments. So all different ways to just explore how our lives interact with the divine.
That's
Wow.
just brilliant. I love that. And I love the book component. I run several book clubs, so I know how important that is to, to talk about that, to have dialogue, to give people things to read and then be able to discuss. So, that's just wonderful. I just love that.
I
That's
should
amazing.
probably pick your brain about some good,
Yeah.
good books for the book club.
Well, and then that leads us to the question that we were talking about, is that of course, you being blessed by other people, and also maybe just talk about some key guests that you had that really have impacted you, that really have maybe changed trajectory in your life or in your podcasts, and just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, one of the nice things, and you guys know this, is you just call whoever you want to talk to, even if they're the biggest, baddest, whatever. All they can do is say no, and maybe they'll say yes, especially if they have a new book out. So one of my heroes for years and years has been travel writer Rick Steves. You know, Rick Steves Europe, and he'll take you all over and tell you what to avoid, or don't miss this, or here's why this thing is important. So I was reading a book of his called Travel as a Political Act. I thought that's kind of interesting. And in the introduction, he sort of gave an outline that ended up being our interview, which is what he had learned faith-wise on this journey that he doesn't usually get to talk about. And so I contacted him through his organization. He never gets to talk about this. He was like, yes, when can we do this? He was so generous, even called the day before and said, oh, I just want to see if we've got a good connection. And just very thoughtful. So he tells this story that his parents took him when he was about 16 to, I believe it was Denmark, Scandinavian country. He's meeting all the family that he'd never met, cousins he'd never met. And they have this huge family picnic, big blanket. They're sitting there with his newly met relatives. And he said he was suddenly filled with this sense of love for these people, some he knew and some he just barely met. And then he said he looked up into this huge park, and it was filled with families all doing the same thing. And he had this just almost shocking realization. He said that, and they all love their people, their families, just as much as I love mine. And this is the love of God we're all feeling. And it was kind of a religious experience, just having a picnic. And once he said that, then we got to talk about just all kinds of ways that faith is meaningful in people's lives. And that was, I when I first talked to him, I said, I need 3 minutes just to be your fanboy here before we can have an actual discussion, or I won't be able to finish this. He was very generous. He's a delight to listen to and a great storyteller.
He's one of my favorites. And I'll tell you, I'm assuming, I don't know if you have, but he actually made like a Rick Steves special, but for the Lutheran Church. He comes from a Lutheran background.
Yeah.
And have you watched that episode? Because it's really, really good.
I'll look that one up. I saw the one he did on Martin Luther, which was really great.
And that might be the one I'm thinking of, because it's funny, because it's like a Rick Steves, but he made it like in on behalf of the Lutheran Church as well. It was kind of like a joint production, as I recall. It's been like 10 years since.
Nice. Yeah.
But yeah, fascinating stuff. And so his faith informs him. And I think that's just so cool, is talking to somebody that, like, I would be fanboying for like 30 minutes with him if I had him on.
One of my favorite guests, and we've had him on twice now, is Ibu Patel, who does a lot of interfaith work in the United States. And they just changed the name of their organization. It's Interfaith America, and he has a podcast. He, for years and years, had just had this vision, first on college campuses, of having interfaith experiences for the students there. And now he's making it broader. And it was really interesting to talk to him. He said that his interfaith work started in the cafeteria in high school, because they sat there with their friend group. His girlfriend was LDS. He was Ismaili Muslim, and they had friends who were Hindus, agnostic, atheist, Catholic, you name it. And he said the interesting but respectful discussions that started there kind of formed the impetus of what's become his life work. And he said he realized that there was something good in his friends that he recognized, some piece of goodness in them, and that it seemed somehow tied to their faith. that something about that sense of faith gave them a goodness or something he felt in common with them, which I'm sure you felt that same thing. But what a thing for him to notice at such a young age.
Wow. Wow. Rebecca?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about, like I said, I run a couple different book clubs. In the Good Book Club, we read last year Zealot by Reza Aslan. And I
Yes.
saw on your guest list that you had Reza on, and I was just very curious about him. He was everyone really, there was quite a bit of dialogue around that book. It was very, very interesting and very eye-opening. So I'm just a fangirl here for him. If you can tell me a little bit about what it was like to interview him.
Yeah, he was coming to Utah. I believe it was to speak at Sunstone as the keynote speaker. And so I just went through channels, and he agreed we could do an interview. If I were willing to drive up to, I think it was Park City, where they had him and his family, cute little kids, and I got to meet his wife. And then they ran to one end of the house, and we sat on a couch and did kind of a back and forth microphone interview like that. And the thing we were asking him about was this whole idea is, are we hardwired to believe as human beings? Is there some element in us that's just adapted so that we benefit somehow? So what he's saying, either it's real or it's something we've made up to get us through. And he's bouncing back and forth between, and he had become Christian at one point and then went back and to Islam, the Sufi tradition, kind of a mystical tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And just so interesting to hear his examples of how we need faith and how we often end up, you've all had this experience, I think, where something happens and you think, was that a miracle? Is that a coincidence? I get to decide because it's not 100% clear. And that's kind of an act of faith, I think, that we often decide, I think I see God in this.
I think it's
a very
bit of both.
personal. Yeah, it's a very personal thing, I think. And that makes sense. His book definitely reflected, like I said, we read the one Zealot, that he had the two backgrounds, Christianity and Islam. And yeah, he definitely left maybe more questions than answers in our discussion. But again, it's personal, and it's how you interpret it and how you feel about it. So yeah, that was fascinating. Very interesting.
Wow.
I would recommend that book for your book club. You'd get a lot of good discussion out of that for sure.
I'll put it on the list. That's a great suggestion. A couple of years ago, one of the congregations, one of the synagogues in Salt Lake City, got a brand new rabbi, and he was very young. And sometimes, people look younger than they are, and so you think, "Are you here to set up chairs?" No, I'm the new rabbi. I just look like I'm 18. And so we had him on when he was brand new in Salt Lake City, and it's interesting how quickly someone who is steeped in helping other people and walking with them through difficult things becomes wise. And I was so impressed with Rabbi Sam Spector. Here, I wrote down something he said. He said that one of the wonderful things about being a rabbi is you get to be a part of people's stories, the joy and the sorrow. And then kind of more ecumenically, maybe that's not the right word, but he said, since God is holy and we are created in God's image, it's blasphemous to him to fail to see holiness in other people, whatever their background, as fellow creations of the Creator. Just the idea that he's doing something wrong or he's falling short if he can't see the holiness in other people.
Amen to that. I'll tell you, that's when I first started this show, the Lord showed me a few things, and he gave me some rules to operate under. And one of the things he told me was he kind of put me in a place where I'm on one side of the street holding the sign, and then there's a person on the other side of the street holding the sign, and we're on opposite sides. And God told me, he said, just remember, Steve, that person holding that sign that you disagree with is a fellow image bearer. And just say fellow image bearer. That's a principle that I've been operating under. And I think that's the key thing, is that we are dealing with fellow image bearers. And even if people we don't like, and we don't like their politics and their views, we still have to realize they are created in God's image.
I like how succinctly you say that, image bearers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If we, I think that's a doorway to actually getting to know God, is seeing him in other people.
Mhm.
You mentioned the rules. Could I talk about that? When we were inventing In Good Faith, you sort of sit down and you write a mission statement or rules of the road, as you just said. And we had just been hearing about a Lutheran bishop, Christopher Stendhal. You've probably heard of him.
Mhm.
And he he talked about this whole divide that you just talked about. In spite of someone's politics or opinions about things, we don't want to believe sometimes what people on the other side have to say. So when he was teaching at Harvard Divinity School, he gave himself 3 rules to talk about religion, and we adopted these for In Good Faith. The first one is, if you want to learn about a religion, ask its adherents, not its detractors.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's what you guys do. It's the idea that you don't talk about people. You have them come in and you talk to them. You talk with them. Because you just avoid so much misunderstanding and all that. The second, I like this one. Don't compare your best with their worst. Because we have a worst too, and they have a best too. And then my favorite is his phrase here, leave room for holy envy, meaning leave room for true admiration of something in another person's religious tradition. Which, so many of the guests, especially some of my Muslim guests, who are very observant of praying 5 times a day, of doing the Ramadan 40 days fasting during the day. And these are evidences of commitment and them working to find a place where they could put down a prayer rug at their work or whatever, and having to work to get accommodations for that, where that's not necessarily how it would be done for instance, the Christian workers or others. And anyway, I've just been really impressed by dedication, and made me think about my own dedication to whatever my most important principles are.
Wow.
I love that. I think that's great. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about, and I'll give an example here, just in some cases, the fear, I don't know if that's too strong of a word, but to get to know other religions or other religious thoughts. So my example is my husband, Tom, who both of you guys know. So he's a curious seeker. And for years, although he was in the LDS faith, he has loved to go and visit other religions, other denominations, other churches, and mostly led by music. He's very musical and he just loves to sing. And he's a member of the Deborah Bonner Unity Black Gospel Choir, So he would go to his regular LDS services and oftentimes drag me along. We would go to all kinds of different churches in the Salt Lake area. We would double dip and we would sing and we would participate. And I loved it. It was wonderful. It was so expansive to me. But then, and this is where kind of the fear or the confusion comes in, we would come back to our LDS ward and he would bear his testimony, or he would incorporate into his lessons as a gospel doctrine teacher some of the things he was learning, or just his amazing, enthusiastic experience. And he sort of came up against this little I don't know if you should be, it was very surprising to us. And I just wonder what your thoughts are. And I'm not saying it's just more, I think it's anyone of any faith that might be a little fearful or confused about why somebody would want to experience and explore this. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing that happens everywhere. But there are some specific aspects to it with LDS people that I'll get to. But first of all, our minds always are preparing for the worst case scenario to protect us. We're walking along, where once I became a parent, I could not walk near any ledge without being certain one of my children was about to plummet off the edge, just like they'd run over and jump off. Constantly being aware of the edges and the danger. And I think sometimes we can easily get into an us and them way of thinking. We have this special mission, and maybe we do, but that doesn't also mean that nobody else has their own mission. So I'll just sneak this little story in. I actually hadn't planned to tell it, but this is part of how we created what we did. I had a friend who was years and years ago, decades, a mission president in the London area. And they started having this amazing success where there had been almost none. And they had made a few little changes. And so someone came out from the missionary department to sort of say, so, President, what are you doing out here that's working so well? And this was then Elder Gordon B. Hinckley, so later church president. And so he arrives, and my friend picks him up, and they start driving to where the lodgings will be. And they say, well, President, we're sure impressed. We're excited to hear about how you're making so much progress. You've doubled what you usually do. And maybe trying to be humble, but I think honestly being humble. My friend said, oh, Elder Hinckley, yes, we were grateful for this few hundred more, but there are 12 million people in our mission. We're just not even making a dent. And Elder Hinckley just laughed and he said, oh, President so-and-so, you don't think the Lord just works through the Latter-day Saints, do you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that just kind of opened his mind as a mission president. I mean, his job is to go convert people, but he was reminded by Elder Hinckley, yeah, God is doing his work everywhere and in everyone. And if you can be close enough to someone and drop the fear and say, what did that experience mean to you? And not always be ready with, well, in my tradition, blah, 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 but actually listen. I think fear dissipates. It's our brains are saying it's unknown. I'm told I'm supposed to be certain and know what I believe. And if someone else says something that makes sense, am I drifting? And I have loved just getting to know people and to love them as image bearers, as you said, Steve. And there's just no fear there. It's just a delight in what's happening there in their lives. Sorry, that took a long time to answer.
I love it. I love it. I actually wanted to. I think what a great story about President Hinckley. That's very eye-opening. And I did want to ask you because, of course, I'm an evangelical.
Yeah.
And I just want to know, what have your interactions with evangelicals been like?
I would say, on one level, I often get the chance to interview people who've been invited to come here on campus for an interfaith event, perhaps, or to explain something to the religion department about their faith and what their theological seminary does. So I have tended to be able to speak with people who are already open to discussion, not to try and convince one another, because I think that should be maybe one of the fourth rules, that if you're having a conversation to convince each other, you're not doing it correctly. But what ends up happening is when people listen respectfully, I would say on every interfaith council, the Salt Lake Interfaith Council, Utah Valley Interfaith, that I have had anything to do with, people feel strengthened in their own faith as they work with other people. And I think that's kind of not what people expect. Like, am I muddying the waters or something like that when I hear no, you're hearing how God is doing his work through his children, all of his children.
You know, it is funny because one of my friends, Nathan Smith, we were having a conversation and he said, Steve, you like to blur lines. And I said, yeah, I sure do. And I think that's so important because, and I will also say, what's so fascinating to me is that there's this new breed of evangelical that's engaging the restoration. That's Jeff McCullough with Hello Saints. That's David Boyce with 52 Churches in 52 Weeks. That's what I'm doing with my program. But I'm also talking to other Christian ministers and apologists who are based in Utah. And some of them I will openly endorse as saying, this is a good Christian apologist. This is not a bad guy. There's a lot of bad Christian apologetics going on in Utah too. Unfortunately, that's the face that a lot of Latter-day Saints are seeing, is the bad arguments, the bad faith, the ugly side of evangelicalism. But there's this new group of people. Oh, you're going to ask something?
Well, you made me think of a guest that I have, a guy I really like. And he and his wife felt called to come from where they lived back east in the South and come to Utah and start a mission. to save Latter-day Saints. So I have him come in as a guest, and we really struck up a friendship. And it was, I think first he was surprised that I was actually not trying to jump on him or condemn this, or because I asked him about his sense of mission. He said, well, you don't want to keep this on your podcast. And then he talked about, I'm here to save you folks, like including you. And I said, of course, I'm going to keep that in the podcast because that's your real lived experience. And it's why you're here. And so should I panic that he's going to be like hunting me down to tackle me and convert me somehow? No, but we stay in touch, and we've been able to talk over the years really respectfully. And I think he was surprised that I was sort of not fazed by his mission to come save me from myself and my false beliefs in some cases, you might say.
That's great. And that's good that you're having those conversations, because it is important. I don't want to exclude and just say, I'm only going to talk to certain groups of people. Like you're doing the same thing. You want to talk to people that are, and so, yeah, you come to the table and you tell your story, make your case,
Mm-hmm.
and let my audience decide, which is exactly the kind of thing I want to do with my channel. Is just, I'm just going to let these people come on and they decide. And that's the beautiful thing. But, as I was, the thing is now that we got all these other Christian evangelicals that I've been engaging with, and they've been coming out of the woodwork and contacting me. And many of these, I have a Baptist minister from Mobile, Alabama, that's working with me. And he's a really cool dude. And there's this other group of Christians that are saying, we got to do something differently. And I would say, but for 200 years, we've been the baddies, right? We've been button heads with the restorations almost from the beginning, right?
Uh-huh.
And where's it gotten us? Right? It ain't gotten us anywhere. And I think it's the most
separated.
It was, yeah, exactly. And see, and this is the thing. I tell people on April 6, 1830, there was a church that was full of spirit-filled, born-again, Bible-believing Christians. It might have been the most Christian church service in America that day. That was the foundation of your church, and we need to remind ourselves of that fact.
You usually, when there's an article or a review, you're not supposed to read the comments, right? That people will go crazy and they think they're anonymous. Sometimes they forget their names on the account and they say things that they would never say to you in person. So we've been doing a little bit of Facebook advertising for In Good Faith. And a lot of people, especially across the South, we get all these responses. People, I don't know if they're tuning in, but they click on the ad because it says Conversations with Believers, and they just say, Amen, thank you, Jesus. And they're giving honest expressions of, oh, yes, Conversations with Believers. I don't know if they've listened yet, but so one guy writes, he said, Jesus is our Lord and Savior. We should not talk to people who are in darkness and don't know that. Bad podcast. So we were a bad podcast because, for instance, we had talked to Muslims or Hindus or Jews, or a whole hour-long thing we did on ways different people relate to God in nature, which some were very traditional and some were way not traditional. And so I think it's that fear you were asking about, Rebecca. You probably know who Brian McLaren is. He's written some really great books, and I had him on. He was talking about his book Faith After Doubt, about stages of faith. And I think that fear comes in that we try and stay in that very first stage that you have to be as a kid, like this is right, this is wrong, we do this, we don't do that, and you need the black and white. But then there's nervousness in moving to stage 2, which is where things start to you start being perplexed a little bit. You realize, oh, it's more complicated than that. And it's moving between those stages. Instead of having fear, to see those as, I think God might be expanding my understanding. And am I willing to be a little bit uncomfortable? I don't know, Steve, do you ever uncomfortable with strange ideas that get get shared with you, or you're just there to listen?
This is the
Steve
thing.
can
I tell
take
people,
anything.
I tell people I'm comfortable in the places that most people are uncomfortable.
So what made you that way? If I can turn the tables here for a minute.
I think that, as a young child, I was very interested in Mormonism as an evangelical, fascinated from the age of 7 or 8 years old. I will also say, and I don't talk about this too much, I've talked about it on a couple podcasts because I don't like to talk about myself too much, but you asked, is I also realized at around that same age that I was gay. And so I tell people, I said that with the world we live in now, the cultural wars, the cultural war was inside me since a young child.
Yeah.
And I recognize the beauty of my faith, but I also recognize many of the things that it gets wrong about things, including wrong about myself. So I really think that because I had this dualism going on, I was self-hating, because of what I was told, right, about gay people. And then as I've grown and accepted myself for who I am, and then have been able to kind of integrate these two things with my faith, it made me very, very sensitive to other people. Even as a kid, if I saw kids sitting by themselves in the lunchroom table, I would go and sit with them.
Right.
I always wanted to be sensitive to those who were maybe on the margins or weren't a popular kid. And then I also felt like I'm the kind of person that if somebody is speaking ill of another person, I don't care who they're speaking ill of, I will step up and defend that person because they're not there to defend themselves. It's an instinctual thing. So I think all these factors kind of molded me into the person that I am, and then it engages me. So I'm like, when I say I like to be, I genuinely mean that. I'm comfortable where most people are uncomfortable, because in one sense, I was uncomfortable in my own skin for most of my life. So I know what it's like to feel that way.
Yeah.
So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I often find that people who are the most empathetic or compassionate earned, or it was forced upon them by just life circumstances, which could be any number of things. It's interesting you say this. I mean, I have a very happy 34-year marriage, 4 kids, 2 granddaughters, but about 3 years ago, I started coming out as a gay man, which is a whole story like yours, growing up in a particular church or milieu that where that's not the favorite thing. I did have some kind of a spiritual experience when I was a teenager, and I was reading this book, The Miracle of Forgiveness, Spencer W. Kimball, which has a few harsh things to say in chapter 6 about anyone who's just a little outside of the majority. And I remember reading some of those words like crime against nature, abomination, and all of this, and that if you haven't spent years knocking and bloodying your knuckles on the door, you haven't done enough to change, and all this. And it was pretty dire to read this, but I had this experience where I call it now revelation. I didn't know what to call it at the time. Suddenly I knew in my head these things. He doesn't understand, and this is not you. And I think maybe that saved me growing up. Just that little piece of knowledge that I thought I'm good with God, and it still wasn't safe to really be open about that back then. But any worry I had was more about, I knew what other people would say. And then so it just kind of became irrelevant because I don't know why. I fell in love with my wife. She's this unique person, and we're just each other's person. I think God said, you guys, I'm just going to help you out. You belong together to do what you need to do. But I did a few years ago have a really strong prompting that it's time to just be out, both for representation and visibility, just so there's not an us and them. Even in the church, people talk about, or in lots of denominations, the LGBTQ people this or that, and it's always some far off separate group. It's like, no, it's people sitting right next to you in your congregation, but they're not safe to bring that up yet. This is a little on to the side of the podcast, but the whole idea of how someone develops understanding and compassion for other people is really interesting. There's not just one way. But yeah, we have that way in common. That's interesting.
That's beautiful,
And we're
man.
both named Steve. I don't know if there's a pattern. They always say, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and
Adam
Steve.
and Steve,
And I was thinking, speaking as Steve,
He made me.
There's a reason I brought you two together.
Wow.
that's very funny.
Beautiful, beautiful.
And,
Wow.
but I also love when I talk to people. It's so interesting how each faith tradition will have its own ideas of what the boundaries are between them and other faiths. And there's some, like Buddhism, I'm always asking, for you, is this a religion or is this a philosophy? And it could be either. Sometimes it's both. And I love their idea, like the Dalai Lama, even he says, don't use what I say to become Buddhist. Use what I say to be better, whatever you are.
Mm-hmm.
That's just real. I kind of have that on a poster in my office as as some good thinking, and it's actually so freeing and joyful to be able to celebrate what is good in other people's faith. Like when I go to a Catholic service or well, any number, some Methodists, United Methodists I've been to, and there's the part where you pass the peace, or pre-COVID we could, and you just turn around and you shake hands with the people who are next to you, and you introduce yourself if you're new, or if you know each other, you say, how's Martha's knee? And just those little interactions, and peace be with you. And I thought, I love that. I wish we kind of had a moment like that, in my sacrament meeting. That would be kind of cool. Hopefully we do that afterwards. But that's a thing that it's okay for me to say, they do that really well. And I like how I feel when I'm part of that. So what can I take from that and incorporate? For me, it's probably passing the stranger in the hall and saying, hey, do you have a second? I notice you're new. What's your name? And just doing the same thing in a different way that fits the culture I'm in.
I think I think there's a lot of loss when people don't explore and understand other religions, or just faith traditions. In my own personal life, my mother was a convert as a young adult, and she really felt somehow that I have one sister. My sister and I couldn't know much about her parents' faith tradition, the faith tradition that she had grown up in. She was a Presbyterian. I mean, my grandma was very high up in the church, very active, wrote for national Presbyterian magazines. My own mother was a Sunday school teacher, in that tradition. But when she joined the church at age 21 and then married my dad, that was gone. I would almost say, looking back at it, actively kept from knowing anything about that tradition. I remember one time when I was a young adult myself, and my grandmother handed me her testimony written out. She said, I'd like to share with you my faith, and she had a little picture of herself and picture of Jesus and some of her articles she'd written.
Mm-hmm.
And before I even had a chance to read it, it kind of disappeared. And I often wonder if my mom, she really was very actively trying to protect my sister and I from this tradition or anything about my grandparents' faith. My grandparents, of course, have now passed away. And as I get older, that is a huge regret. I do not know what their traditions were. And it was such a huge part of their lives. And I will never have any way of knowing exactly what that meant. And I'm sure that's fear, maybe on my mom's part. Didn't want to muddy the water, confuse her daughters, but there's the loss there that I feel. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, but I think we lose a lot when we don't open ourselves to understanding others and their traditions.
Yeah, there's a richness in that. I'm thinking of a lady, she's a professional storyteller, Shonali Cumber. She's from the UK, the most delightful accent, and one of my favorite guests, probably because she's a storyteller. But so she's Jewish, and her grandmother picked her at one point and said, you're the one I'm going to teach to be a drutzilla, which is this Jewish women's storytelling, a way of preserving thousands and thousands of little wisdom stories. And this isn't written down like the Torah or the Mishnah or anything like that, but it's been this oral tradition that was almost wiped out in World War II. And so Shonali, I mean, it's like this building in her mind her grandmother helped her create, and she can go in the rooms, and at the drop of a hat, she has thousands of stories at her fingertips of the wisdom of, and I think what you just said, you missed out on maybe some wisdom of knowing why your grandmother believed. And it's just because it was an oral tradition, this tradition of the Drutzilla. Oh, I love what she said. Her grandmother first talked to her, said, do you know why God created people? Because he loves a good story. And I think we provide lots of entertainment for our divine creator. Watching us muddle through. But yes, to be open to, for instance, here in Utah, I love that something that is sort of New World Catholic, which is Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. So this year BYU has a Day of the Dead ofrenda where you could put up a picture and you could light a candle and you could hear about this Catholic tradition that sort of started here in the New World, kind of mixing cultures and faiths together. But I was really happy that that was kind of thought of as something that was cool, and the university newsletter said, come learn about this. And so that just seems like this element of fear was gone. It was like, we can hear why this ties these people to their ancestors, the stories that are told, of the pictures they put on the ofrenda, all of that. Yeah, we can benefit so much from being willing to hear.
This is, first of all, I just want to thank you, Steve, for opening up and sharing your story. Rebecca, isn't this pretty uncanny how we have an idea of how podcasts can go, and then God throws us a curveball. And
it happens every time, which is why I have goosebumps all the time whenever I'm doing this.
And I just think it's so awesome. And your story, man, this is great stuff, man. And just what I love is that you've been able to engage all these different people, and then in different ideas and traditions, and you're quoting these people, and it's informing your faith, it's informing yourself. I just want to ask you about your faith. Where are you at right now? What does your faith mean to you?
I really like that question because it's one I try and ask myself a little more deeply, at least once a year. I mean, you can think about it daily, but if you have to get up every day, like what's that movie about where Drew Barrymore has injured her head, and every day she wakes up and has no memories. Repeat, and so she has to watch a videotape that explains her life and what happened. And that when you walk through the store, you have a husband and children and all the rest. You just can't do that with faith. Every day, get up. If you have to get up and play yourself the videotape of I believe, I'm supposed to believe, put away the videotape, because I just don't think God is in that. What I have loved is finding a place of peace where there are many things that I want to know that I don't know. Some that it seems like I can't know. I have become okay with the not knowing. And I think sometimes maybe because in the Latter-day Saint tradition, we're supposed to say, I know, and we're supposed to be able to quote someone and it's exactly that way, even if there's another quote that says something slightly different. That whole idea of not quote, I know, that is threatening to some people because they feel we are supposed to be certain. In my opinion, if you have absolute certainty about something, you don't need faith. You know it. I mean, the Book of Mormon says that once you see it happening, suddenly you know it. It's not faith. I like the aspect of my faith that makes it so I have to decide what to think and what to believe about people I meet, about things that happen in my life. Was that an answer to prayer? I try and be open to sense what I perceive as direction from the Spirit. So my faith is at a place where there are very, very few things that I would say I know. And there's a lot I believe. There's a whole bunch I hope. but faith, hope, and belief, faith, hope, and love, I don't know, those aren't bad things. We put them all together. I feel very comfortable, maybe more than ever, and maybe partly because of engaging with people of other faiths, in my own faith and in my connection, even though I love 10 times more that I have with God, but there is a presence that I have come to feel in my life. And I just watch for those little things that tell me I see God working here. Did that answer your question, Steve?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. I will say that I have had to, because of going through depression and other stuff earlier in my life.
Yeah.
I at one point have had to differentiate between my connection with God and my connection with the church. Not to disregard one and regard the other, but just to know that they are two different things. That my relationship with Jesus, to me, has saving power. My relationship to the church is something else, and that's my chance to serve a community. That's my chance to discuss and to learn. It's where I get ideas about who God might be and what I could pursue. So I think that's been important to me. Being okay not knowing things, really being okay with not knowing certain things, and then the second thing, which is just feeling a connection with God independent of my denomination. Maybe we're not supposed to say that, but that's how I feel.
You know, I had, and Rebecca, I want you to chime in, but I just have to ask this question. I feel impressed to ask this question. I want to ask you, who is Jesus to you?
He is the one that if I have to talk about him in church, I'm pretty likely to cry, because I'm a freelance tour guide on the side. Like, I used to do LDS church history in the US for Morris Murdoch escorted tours. Now I take groups to Israel. This year I'll be taking February and March, my 16th and 17th groups over there. That is my favorite 10 days of the year, is when I am there and I'm literally getting to walk in certain places in the footsteps of Jesus. So to me, he may turn out to be something different than I understand, and I'll be okay with whatever. But that is one of the things that I would say I know as much as I can know something, is that he is real and that there is a connection. And there was a time of me desperately trying to find God. I mean, I can't be the only one who ever has been sort of on a heap on the rug in the family room floor and yelling to God, "Where the hell are you?" Because I think I see you working in all these ways, but I need you to show up in this particular way. And then not having him reach out in that particular way, but starting to see the other ways. And me starting to trust, okay, this whole idea of being a shepherd is true because I am being shepherded bit by bit. I don't know exactly to where, but the more I follow it, that's rock, that's anchor, that's the thing I know, is that connection. I'm glad you asked.
Thank you, Steve. I'm glad you answered. Thank you. Beautiful. Rebecca.
I was just going to say, what a beautiful answer. No, I think you've covered it, Steve. Like I said, I get goosebumps all the time. That's beautiful. No, just wonderful. What a great conversation.
When I walk out from interviewing people, I just almost without exception feel like I'm a foot taller or floating on air, and just like, I have hope for the world. Look at these good people.
Oh, wow. What a great talk we had today, folks. And I'm audience, I want you to leave your comments. How you feel about this episode, but also maybe tell me what Jesus means, who is Jesus to you, and what your faith means to you as well. I'd like to have a dialogue, a conversation. And I think that what you're doing is a beautiful thing. I do believe that, God works through us. I tell people it's not the works that we do, it's the work that he does through us. It's the most important thing, and they'll be allowed to be used as an instrument for the Savior. And I want to thank you for the work you do. I want to just ask you real quick. Your podcast can be found. Can people listen to it on Sirius XM as well on BYU Radio?
Yes. Sirius XM 143 is BYU Radio, and you'll hear In Good Faith several times a day.
Okay.
You can go to byuradio.org/ingoodfaith if you want to check out the website. But wherever you get a podcast, just type in Good Faith. There's actually, I think, 3 different podcasts with the same title. Yeah. So ours is the one with the green logo.
Okay. All right. So In Good Faith, check it out. It's a really awesome project you're doing. And I also want to thank the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Brigham Young University that helps provide you this platform. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sitting here in our performance studio, excuse me, here. It's a beautiful facility. Both the university and the church have made a big commitment to broadcast and to sharing. And we really appreciate it here.
That's awesome. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for being co-host. Thank you so much for booking this guest. This was awesome.
Yeah, it was amazing. And I'm telling you, it was Tom that was the one, who'd be really good. So, kudos to Tom.
Thanks to Tom, and thanks, Rebecca and Steve, very much. This has been a pure pleasure.
Amen to that. So, Steve, thanks again. We love you. And folks, I just want to remind you, there will be links in the descriptions to his podcast. Also, for those of you who'd like to financially support the channel on PayPal and Patreon, you can support us there. Also, don't forget the merch store. You got the mug there? There we go. Merch store, MormonBookReviews.com. If you want to buy some merch, we always do appreciate those of you. And I think the coffee mug is our best-selling thing, which is a little ironic. Or maybe it's a hot chocolate mug. I don't know. Either way, I just want to thank you so much again. Just remember, the most important thing here, folks, is all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.